The second movement of the Chichester Psalms contains Psalms 23 and a portion of Psalms 2. Throughout this video, we'll discuss the biblical interpretation of these texts and how Bernstein used these passages. Let us start with the biblical interpretation by reading the text that Bernstein used in the second movement of the Chichester Psalms. He starts with the first half of Psalms 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He taketh me down to lie in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me to the path of righteousness, for his name's sake. Yes, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Bernstein goes on to use the first 4 verses of Psalms 2. Why do the nations rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bands asunder, and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in heaven shall laugh, and the Lord shall have them in derision. Lastly, Bernstein finishes this movement with the end of Psalms 23. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemy. Thou hast anointed my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me to all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Psalms 23 is a famous psalm to this day for providing comfort in times of distress. According to Phil Botha and his essay, Following the Tracks of Righteousness, this psalm presents 2 positive images of God's character, one of him being a shepherd, verses 1 and 3 in the first stanza, and one of him being a host, verses 5 and 6 in the second. These 2 images are used to highlight God's comprehensive care for our physical protection and spiritual needs through the use of parallel imagery. For example, as a shepherd, God brings us to green pastures, and as a host, God brings us to the table. The interesting thing about these 2 stanzas is at the beginning of the first stanza, the psalmist creates, I shall not want, but in the second stanzas, the psalm states, My cup runneth over. Throughout these 2 stanzas, there's a lot of parallel imagery, but the first stanza talks about God and the worshiper on the journey, while the second stanza illustrates God and the worshiper in his temple. This psalm indirectly alludes to God's provision of his people during the Exodus. It also reflects God's promise to bring Israel out of the promised land. As Botha states, it thus seems that the psalmist was not only aware of his shepherd context, but he made contrapuntal use of them to emphasize his own theological disposition in contradistinction to that of the implied forefathers. The psalmist was attempting to show that God was always there to provide for the needs of Israel. It is also interesting to note that the green pastures and still waters are not simply a way to express tranquility and peace. According to Linder E. Keck in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, these verses are designed to show how God keeps his anointed alive. Keck states, For a sheep to lie down in green pastures means to have food. To be led beside still waters means to have something to drink. And to be led in right paths means that danger is avoided and proper shelter is attained. In short, God restores my soul, or better translated, God keeps me alive. The sheep lacks nothing because the shepherd provides the basic necessities of life, that being food, drink, and shelter. According to Ron Tappy in the article, Psalms 23, Symbolism and Structure, verse 4 separates the psalmist's description of God with how God is working in his circumstances. Tappy states, in addition to the quasi-narrative conjunction gam ki, which means even though, it aids in setting it apart from the preceding verses. It is in this portion of the psalm that the theme of the entire psalm is stated, the theme being trust and confidence in the Lord's provision. Tappy also states, verse 4 epitomizes confession of trust, the major theme of the psalm of trust. This is the strongest declaration of personal trust and vulnerability that is seen in any of the psalms. Psalms 2 presents a different picture of God, however. It talks about God laughing at those who wish to break away from the Lord and go against his will. In this passage, God is seen as the almighty ruler. Linder E. Keck talks about how Psalms 2 relates back to Psalms 1 in the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary when he says, in effect, Psalms 2 portrays in corporate terms what Psalms 1 depicts in individual terms, that being the contrast between the righteous who are open to God's rule and the wicked who assert themselves and make their own plans in opposition to God's rule. In this portion of Chichester's Psalms, God is seen as the judge. This time, God is not simply leading us to peace or providing for our needs. He is judging those who run in opposite direction of him. The psalmist finds much comfort in the embrace of the Lord because aspects in both psalms: the provision and security of God and the strength of his mighty hand in conquering the wicked. I believe the end of Psalms 23 really hits the point of Chichester's Psalms. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Bernstein used two passages to create a well-rounded view of God that shows his loving kindness for his people and his justice for the wicked on the earth. In the next section of this video, we'll talk about how Bernstein uses the music to emphasize key portions of these biblical passages. Before we fully dive into the music, however, I think it is first important to comment on how Bernstein began his work on the Chichester Psalms. According to a journal written by Ethan Nash, Bernstein began a 15-month sabbatical from the New York Philharmonic, in which he thought he would be able to collaborate with lyricist Betty Comden and Adolph Green on a musical version of The Skin of Your Teeth. This was a troubling time for the writer because he was dealing with the loss of a close friend and fellow composer Mark Bernstein, as well as the loss of President Kennedy. Bernstein was surely excited about this project, considering he was collaborating with some of the most famous playwrights and directors of his time. The project came to a crashing halt after 6 months of working. Nash states that all the collaborators did not see their work going anywhere and therefore abandoned the project, which they felt was necessary. It was 6 months of work down the drain. It is important to note that almost half of Bernstein's sabbatical was wasted. If this had not happened, Bernstein would not have been able to accept commission that was necessary to write the Chichester Psalms. This commission coming from Walter Hussey, who is the dean of the Chichester Cathedral. Since Bernstein had already had material that started from The Skin of Our Teeth, he used that to start each movement. It is said that the material from a sketchbook of the play ultimately became the basis for the thematic material in all 3 movements of the Chichester Psalms. I believe that this experience also influenced the musical elements that he includes in the text. In an interview in 1982, he even poses the question, "Who are you if you are not the sum of everything that happens before?" With these things in mind, let's dive into the musical text. In the second movement of the Chichester Psalms, Bernstein uses word painting with the text of Psalms 23 and Psalms 2. The movement opens with a boy soprano or countertenor singing a very soft, sweet melody, with the text, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The melody that accompanies this solo includes strings and a harp, which produces an angelic motive. Harp brings the movement with solo chords, and the melody floats off the stage. It has a very lullaby-esque quality. That solo melody is often repeated by the soprano and alto members in the choir, but this time a canon is 1 measure apart. This canon allows the melody to still have an angelic quality, but also produces sounds of dissonance because of the major seconds and chromatic neighbor tones that result from layering the melody 1 measure apart. Then very abruptly and unexpectedly, the lower voices enter the movement with a very intense counter-melody, which utilizes the text from Psalms 2, "Why do the nations rage?" Bernstein uses his counterpoint in this example partially because he wants there to be an extreme contrast between the 2 voices, and partly because he has a history of doing this and doing it very well. Sean Hickey writes, "It is not difficult to imagine sharks and jets squaring off to this music." He continues to use his canon because it comes up again in these 2 lower voices later in the movement, and it makes it very unclear where the beat is, as well as being very unsettling for the listener. Both canons represent Bernstein's love of polytonality, as we will see in other movements of this work and others of his. After these 2 sections are over, Bernstein makes the movement even more complicated and puts the innocent melody and the raging counter melody together. It is very unusual because 2 time signatures are being done at one time. The listener can interpret this layering in one of 2 ways, the first being that the innocent melody is completely oblivious to all the commotion and instability that exists in the lower voices, or the second being a bit more optimistic, saying that despite the constant commotion and instability, the upper voices can still sing a beautiful melody. movement ends with the sweet melody returning to all voices. However, the orchestra echoes the raging counter melody until the movement finally ends with a bang. Well, this is the end of our in-depth look at Bernstein's Chichester Psalms. Hope you enjoyed listening and watching. Hope you learned something as well. Thank you for watching.